Jake returned home late in the evening after a long business trip. He was weary from the journey but felt a sense of relief to be back. His wife, Jessica, whom he had affectionately started calling Jess since their college days, was there waiting for him, greeting him with a gentle smile. She looked different somehow, perhaps more vibrant, more energetic, and tonight there was something else, a certain quality he couldn't quite place. But Jake dismissed it, attributing it to the exhaustion in his eyes after spending too much time in airports. "Jake, honey, I have some news," Jess said, a faint but almost shy grin forming on her face. Her eyes sparkled, but Jake noticed something in them that didn't quite align with the smile she wore. "I'm pregnant," she whispered. Jake froze for a moment, the words hanging in the air, seeming to stretch longer than usual as if they were a sound that refused to fade. It felt like an echo, one he wasn't prepared to confront. He quickly regained his composure, offering her a comforting nod and drawing her into a soft embrace. He reminded himself to show happiness, even though, deep down, he felt something strange weighing on him. "That's wonderful, Jess," he said quietly. Jess took a deep breath and squeezed his hand just a little more tightly. "We're going to have twins, Jake." "Twins?" The word settled heavily in Jake's chest, the weight of it sinking deeper than he could have expected. He forced a smile and nodded as she excitedly talked about doctors, due dates, and other details that felt foreign to him. He knew he was supposed to feel joy, but instead, all he could muster was an empty sense of acceptance, struggling to mirror her excitement. Before long, Jess was on to another subject. "Oh, and we'll need to plan one of those big gender reveal parties. Maybe with fun contests and games. Doesn't that sound fun?" She bounced with excitement, her eyes lighting up. "Sure," Jake replied, his fatigue barely hidden. "Whatever you want, Jess." Their young son, Alex, who had been listening from the other room, perked up at the mention of a party. His face brightened at the thought of games and celebrations. Jake gave Alex a smile, ruffling his hair, but something in the pit of his stomach still gnawed at him. He spent some time with Alex, letting the boy ramble on about the party ideas, but even as he listened, Jake couldn't shake the sense of suspicion creeping into his thoughts. Jess's announcement had only solidified something he had feared for months. He had uncovered pieces of Jess's secrets, and now, hearing about the twins, he couldn't deny it any longer. Something was wrong, and their family was teetering on the edge of a change. Jake felt like he was standing alone, watching the crossroads ahead. A few days later, Jake found himself once again on his way to the airport for another business trip. His life had become a rhythm, set by the frequent flights and hotel stays. Traveling for work was just part of the job, and he had grown used to the long hours, the sterile air of hotel rooms, and the unfamiliarity of new cities. For years, he hadn't worried about what was happening at home. He trusted Jess completely, believing their marriage was built on trust and love. But as he settled into his seat on the plane, a strange weight pressed against his chest. It was a sensation he hadn't experienced before, a quiet unease that had been creeping up on him for months. Jake had always been confident in his relationship with Jess, never once questioning her loyalty. But now, small details that he had previously overlooked were resurfacing, pulling at him with a persistent tug. He opened his laptop, but instead of his usual work files, he clicked on a folder he had kept hidden away even from himself. It wasn't a collection of business documents, but something far more troubling. As he scrolled through the contents, his eyes scanned the images and videos, each one adding to the knot of unease growing inside him. A sickening sadness washed over him, and anger simmered beneath the surface, a feeling he had been trying to ignore. Jake closed his eyes, leaning back in his seat, trying to shake off the sense of betrayal creeping into his bones. His thoughts drifted, and suddenly an image of Brian, his neighbor, appeared in his mind. Brian, with his friendly smile, the way he'd come over to help Jake clear the yard last summer without hesitation. Brian, who always had a joke ready, a friendly pat on the back, and a laugh that made everything seem light. Could someone really be that good, that warm, that open, without something darker lurking beneath the surface? The thought lingered, sour and unshakable, in Jake's mind. People could be like chameleons, he told himself. They could hide their true selves behind masks, especially those closest to you. That was what unsettled him most, the possibility that he'd been deceived. It all came back to one inescapable truth, one he couldn't stop dwelling on even as the plane soared high above the world that suddenly felt distant and alien to him. Jake knew what was ahead. He had to prepare himself for the party Jess had so eagerly planned, the grand gender reveal event that she couldn't stop talking about. She had said it would happen in a few months, teasing that it would be an unforgettable event, something their friends and family would remember for years to come. But as Jake sat staring out at the overcast sky beyond the window, he realized that for him, this party wouldn't be about the usual balloons or colorful confetti. No, it would serve as a backdrop for something far more significant. He felt the overwhelming urge to end it all, to tear down the fragile life he and Jessica had built, to finally free himself from the lie that had him trapped. But he couldn't. Not yet. He needed time to settle everything. There was too much on the line. If he acted now, he might lose far more than just his peace of mind. For the first time, Jake found himself questioning everything he once believed about his family, even his little son, Alex. Alex was only 6, innocent and pure in heart and eyes. The last thing Jake wanted was for his son to be swept into a storm that was never his fault. So Jake decided to wait. He would hold on to his suspicions, bide his time, and quietly lay the groundwork for his escape, a path that would allow him to walk away from the life he once cherished, with his head held high and his possessions intact. The weeks dragged on, each one a peculiar blend of resentment, patience, and subtle preparations. Jessica was completely wrapped up in her pregnancy, planning every little detail of the twins' arrival with an enthusiasm that would have been contagious in a different life. She went on and on about cribs, baby clothes, and the fun that awaited at the gender reveal party, never noticing the shift in Jake. She didn't see how his once open gaze had grown calculating, or how he started staying up late, not for work, but to gather everything he'd need for the journey he was preparing to make alone. Jake played the part of the devoted husband, keeping up appearances while quietly getting ready for the life he'd soon live by his own rules. He met with his lawyer in secret, made careful changes to his financial situation, and arranged a new, modest living space far away from the pretentious world he had come to despise. He even made time to investigate matters concerning Alex, a task that had kept him up at night, weighed down with worry. As the months passed, Jake became a master of patience. He would smile when required, laugh at the right moments, but all the while he grew more determined. Then the day arrived. The day of the long-awaited reveal. Their backyard had been transformed into a colorful spectacle with tables, flowers, and banners greeting guests. Friends and family mingled, while Jessica, glowing and full of joy, beamed from the center of it all. The guests lined up for food, guessing whether the babies would be boys or girls. Jake moved through the crowd, quiet and distant, his mind far away from the casual conversations around him. He wore his best suit, one that hadn't seen the light of day in years, but it fit him sharply, matching the intense look in his eyes. His gaze briefly landed on Brian, who was laughing with a neighbor by the refreshment table. For a moment, Brian noticed Jake and smiled, but Jake didn't return it. Today, he didn't need to pretend anymore. Standing tall, Jake scanned the scene before him like a hawk, feeling the weight of months of secrecy and silent resolve. He was ready to take the step he had been preparing for all this time, the step that would free him from the tangled web his life had become. Before we move forward, make sure to subscribe to the channel. The moment had arrived. Jessica, practically glowing with excitement, took her place on the small platform they had set up in the backyard. She gathered everyone's attention, smiling broadly as she began her speech. "Thank you all for coming to celebrate this special day with us," she began, looking out over the crowd of family, friends, and neighbors. "Family means everything to us, and with our 2 little ones on the way, we're so excited to start this new chapter in our lives together." She paused for a moment, clearly savoring the occasion. "So, we thought a fun little contest would make today even more special." The crowd clapped eagerly, everyone excited for the big reveal. In the center of the platform, a large balloon hung, filled with confetti that would either be pink or blue. Jessica turned to Jake, her eyes sparkling with anticipation. He took a deep breath, feeling the pressure of the past few months weighing on him. Still, he managed to maintain his composure. "Before we reach the crucial moment," Jake said, raising his hand to quiet the crowd, "I'd like to give my wife a small gift." Jessica appeared taken aback, surprised by his sudden gesture. She smiled, likely thinking it was just another thoughtful surprise to add to the day's festivities. Jake handed her a box, its wrapping neat and colorful, the ribbon perfectly tied. However, the vivid colors of the paper seemed almost at odds with the serious expression in his eyes. The crowd fell into a hushed silence, eagerly awaiting the reveal of the gift. Jessica slowly opened the box, her smile gradually fading as she peeled back the paper and lifted the lid. Inside, she found 2 stacks of papers. The first was a thick pile, stamped with the unmistakable label, "Divorce Papers." The second, much thinner but equally painful, was labeled DNA test results, with both Jake's and Alex's names printed in bold letters. Jessica's face drained of color as she pulled the documents out, trying to understand what she was holding. Murmurs began to spread through the crowd, confusion rippling like a wave. Everyone stood frozen, waiting for an explanation, Yet none came. Jake turned to face the onlookers, his voice cutting through the silence. "I shouldn't be the one standing here," he declared, his tone sharp and unwavering. "These twins, this grand reveal, it's not meant for me. It's meant for Brian." He pointed toward the neighbor standing awkwardly at the back, still holding his drink. "Brian should be up here, he should be the one to pop the balloon." The crowd gasped. Eyes immediately turned toward Brian, whose face looked as though he had just been struck by lightning. He stood frozen, his face pale, his eyes wide with shock. His wife, standing beside him, stiffened, gripping her glass so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Jessica, still reeling from the sudden turn of events, looked at Jake, tears beginning to well up in her eyes. Her voice trembled as she whispered, her words barely audible. "Jake, these are divorce papers and a DNA test. What's going on? Why are you doing this?" Jake met her gaze, his eyes full of cold resolve. "Jessica," he said softly but firmly, "I know more than you think. I know about the secret life you've been living, the lies you've been telling me while I worked hard to provide for our family. And as for how I found out, well, it's all there in black and white. I did what I had to do. Alex and I deserved the truth." The guests exchanged glances, whispers growing louder as the reality of the situation started to sink in. The sense of betrayal spread like a heavy fog, and the crowd stood motionless, stunned by what had just unfolded. A tense silence settled over the yard as everyone processed the gravity of the moment. Still clutching the divorce papers and DNA results, Jessica appeared as though her world had just crumbled before her. She blinked, her lips parted, too shocked to speak, while Jake stood firm, his expression unreadable. He waited patiently, allowing the silence to stretch uncomfortably. Then, after taking a slow, steady breath, Jake spoke again. "Well, Jess, why don't we get back to what you had planned?" He nodded toward the black balloon hanging above them. "After all, everyone's waiting for the big reveal." Jessica stood there, wide-eyed and shaking, staring at him in disbelief. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Jake stepped forward, addressing the crowd with a tone of weary authority. "You know, it's strange how life works. While I was busy working, planning for a future with my wife and son, my so-called faithful wife was out there. Let's just say, she found herself some adventures." He turned slightly, scanning the crowd with his gaze. "I could show you all the footage from the cameras I installed at home," he said flatly, "but I'd rather spare you the discomfort of watching those videos. You don't need to see the details to understand what's been going on." Gasps rippled through the crowd as the weight of his words hit home. Some guests exchanged disbelieving looks, while others stood frozen in stunned silence. Jessica's friends covered their mouths, their shock and confusion written clearly on their faces. Jessica herself was breathing heavily now, her expression a mix of horror and humiliation. "But that's not even the worst part," Jake continued, his voice now colder than ever. He locked eyes with Jessica, who seemed to shrink under his gaze. "The worst part is that all of this made me question everything I thought I knew. I did a DNA test with Alex," he paused, allowing the tension to build. "Turns out, Alex isn't my son." Jessica's face turned bright red with anger and disbelief. "No, Jake, no, this is insane," she cried, her voice rising in pitch. "What kind of sick joke is this? Alex is your son, and these babies, they're yours too." But as she spoke, the confidence in her voice began to fade, and guilt flashed across her face. Jake shook his head, unfazed by her reaction. The last paragraph rephrased. Jake stood tall, unmoving, as he spoke in a calm yet firm voice. The reality was undeniable, and he knew the truth was now out in the open. "I'm unsure of who Alex's father is, Jessica. It could be Brian, but I am absolutely certain that Brian is the father of these twins." The crowd stood in complete silence as Jake's words took hold and everyone's gaze shifted toward Brian. He stood there, pale and stiff, his mouth open in shock, unable to react. His wife, standing beside him, looked at him with a mixture of disbelief, hurt, and simmering rage. Jake waved at the crowd as though nothing out of the ordinary had happened, like it was just another gathering and another farewell. "For those of you interested in further details, you're welcome to join me in divorce court," he said calmly but with unyielding conviction. But as for me, it's time to move forward to leave behind a life filled with lies and betrayal. A ripple of whispers spread among the guests as Jake took one last, lingering look around the yard. Unable to hold her emotions back, Jessica broke down in tears, her voice rising into frantic cries. "No, this is all a lie, Jake. You can't believe this. I am your wife. I am loyal to you. This is just some sick misunderstanding." She stumbled toward him, clutching the divorce papers in her hands, desperately pleading, "Jake, please." But Jake turned away, walking briskly toward the gate. Brian, enraged, tried to stop him. "Jake, hold on, we need to talk. You can't just walk away from this," he hissed, reaching out to grab him. Without breaking his stride, Jake easily sidestepped Brian and, with a swift motion, sent him crashing to the ground. Looking down at him, Jake's voice was low but firm. "You're not my neighbor, Brian. You're not my friend. You're no different from Jess. You're a traitor, and I have nothing else to say to you." Without another word, Jake stepped over Brian's sprawled form and walked toward his car. The guests parted, making way for him as he passed. Jake got into the driver's seat, casting one last glance at the stunned crowd around him, and started the engine. With a final steady look behind him, he pulled out of the driveway, leaving behind the gasps, the murmurs, and the shattered remnants of his past. No one knew where he was headed, but Jake was driving toward a future that finally belonged to him, one that was his to shape. In the months that followed, Jake attended the divorce hearings with an unshakable composure. Every move he made was deliberate, each step showing how thoroughly he had prepared for this moment. He had been anticipating this day for a long time, ensuring that all his assets were secure, carefully hidden, and untouchable. With a precision only he understood, Jake shielded his finances, leaving no room for Jessica to take anything from him. Every account, investment, and piece of property had been transferred into an entity that was completely beyond her reach. When Jake walked into the courthouse, he knew he had the upper hand. No matter what Jessica or her lawyer tried, they wouldn't succeed in touching what he had protected. The evidence he presented left the courtroom speechless. Along with the divorce papers, Jake submitted hours of video footage from the hidden cameras he'd set up in their home. The footage showed Jessica in multiple rooms of the house, wrapped in Brian's arms, laughing, whispering, and slipping into places that should have been reserved for Jake. The tapes, combined with Jake's account of working tirelessly on the road to support his family, painted a damning picture. The judge's expression hardened as he watched the footage, while Jessica, unable to meet anyone's eyes, fidgeted uncomfortably in her seat. The birth of the twins brought the final blow to Jessica and Brian's remaining hopes of any future together. A DNA test confirmed what Jake had known all along. Brian was the father, not just of the twins but of Alex, the little boy Jake had raised as his own. The revelation shattered everything, exposing a secret 6-year affair that had been going on for almost half of Jake and Jessica's marriage. The timeline left no room for doubt. Jessica and Brian had been entangled in their deception for years. Brian soon found himself in his own courtroom battle. Upon learning the truth, his wife had filed for divorce, armed with the evidence Jake had shared with her out of decency. She walked away with nearly everything, including a hefty alimony check. Brian, once the man Jake had laughed and joked with over the backyard fence, now faced the harsh reality of supporting 3 children while trying to cover his overwhelming financial obligations. As for Jessica and Brian, they were left with nothing but each other, piles of debt, alimony payments, and the enormous responsibility of raising 3 children without the security and trust they had once taken for granted. Meanwhile, Jake emerged from the trial with everything he had hoped for. He retained his assets, and his dignity was intact, knowing he had not allowed himself to be fooled any longer than was necessary. In the courtroom, it was clear to everyone that Jessica's defenses had crumbled, that her attempts to paint herself as a misunderstood woman had failed. The last paragraph, rephrased. People in the courtroom could see right through Jessica's attempts to defend herself and her efforts to portray herself as a victim of a situation she couldn't control. The truth, undeniable and clear, had been revealed, leaving Jessica to confront the consequences of the decision she had made all those years ago, whether out of choice or impulse. With the final ruling in his favor, Jake exhaled deeply, feeling a sense of relief he hadn't experienced in years. The burden of doubt, sorrow, and betrayal was finally lifted. He no longer saw himself as the blindsided husband. Instead, he was the man who had faced the storm, prepared himself for whatever came his way, and emerged from it stronger than ever. As he stepped out of the courthouse for the final time, Jake's thoughts shifted toward the future. His mind wandered to a peaceful beach, somewhere sunny and warm, with endless views of the ocean. That would be his next destination, he decided, a place where the sound of the waves could wash away the noise and pain of the past year. He imagined the sun and salty breeze healing both his heart and mind, gradually putting him back together. All he wanted now was peace, a fresh start, and the chance to rebuild his life without the shadows of betrayal hanging over him. And at long last, he was free to begin that journey. If you liked the story, please subscribe to the channel. Wishing you great moods and lots of good luck.